little bit different strategy. They look at the South. And with their southern strategy, because there are more loyalists in the South, they believe that they would be able to, through a number of small victories in the South, they would be able to kind of pacify the countryside, and then ultimately, by having these small victories, they would be able to move farther north and not have to worry about what was going out in the frontier. So the British will launch a small amphibious force in Savannah. Okay, sorry, let me get to my note here. Okay, they will launch a small amphibious force into Savannah, okay, into Georgia, down here, right? And then their hope is to be able to take and go up the Savannah River to be able to defeat anybody out in the back country, okay? And that's kind of their plan with the South here. Led largely by General Clinton. Yes, Clintons. We never escape them in U.S. history. Like it or don't. What?
They're always there.
They're always there. Okay. But led by General Clinton, General Clinton will actually bring the Army of New York, and he'll also bring that down into the Carolinas to be, or to Carolina down to Charleston, and is able to take Charleston as well. Okay. By July of 1781, then, the British hold, or by July of 1780, sorry, the British are able to hold both Savannah and Charleston, as well as numerous other outposts within Georgia. But what they don't recognize, or what the British fail to realize, is that those coming in from the frontier are not going to be loyal. What you have to understand in America, in the frontier, in the South, just like in the frontier in the North, the people living on the frontier were much different socially, economically, everything than the people that lived on the coast, okay, or closer to the coast. These individuals were not large planters. They were small scale, what Jefferson will call yeoman farmers, okay? They plant for themselves. They plant to sell a little bit extra, but largely they are not selling large, profitable, they're not large cash crop agriculture. Does that make sense? And because they're not large cash crop agriculture, they don't see a need to be aligned with Great Britain. In fact, they largely don't like those colonial planters that have so much wealth on, like, in the larger cities or closer to the coast, because of the fact that they socially have always struggled against those individuals, right? The planter elite versus the backcountry yeoman farmer. Most of the policies that will be created by the colony of Georgia favor the large planter and ignore the yeoman. Just like what we had seen up here in the backcountry with the issues that surrounded Bacon's Rebellion, those same kind of issues exist in the frontier in the South. Does that make sense? And that same tension exists in there. So, because of the brutality of the British, because of the ongoing tension with the planter elite versus those in the backcountry, the Continental Army will be able to resist largely because of the work of Nathaniel Greene. Nathaniel Greene is a frontiersman and a marksman. He is also supported by Daniel Morgan, who was a marksman, and he would literally sit there in the woods and just pick off loyalists and British soldiers as they walked by. And they could never find Daniel Morgan. In fact, Daniel Morgan is so effective that single-handedly, Daniel Morgan will kill 160 and capture 860. Yeah, like, he has some serious skills when it comes to using a rifle. But Nathaniel Greene, who was sent to South Carolina largely by Congress and his forces, Greene will send 300 of his men with a man by the name of Francis Marion, and they will go to try to attack the British. And at first they're just basically attacking the British in little skirmishes. A lot of guerrilla warfare that's going on in the South, and it's just little minor attacks here and there. But that constant presence and that constant fear of where Nathaniel Greene or where Daniel Morgan were largely wears out the British in this partisan warfare. And so Morgan is basically able to force Cornwallis and his men to pretty much march, and they march and march and march until his men are absolutely exhausted as they try to flee the Morgan and Greene and Marion. Okay, and largely that allows them also to take outposts, British outposts in the South, one by one by one. So by July of 1781, British only still hold on to Savannah and hold on to Charleston. Okay, because of them just kind of having these two locations at this point, and because of the mutiny that begins to occur within the Continentals, in fact, in the Pennsylvania line in particular, a group of men get drunk, a group of the soldiers get drunk, and they kill 3 of their commanding officers.
On the British?
Yeah, the British. This is on the British side. They ultimately, those men are discharged, and we also see them be brought eventually to trial in Great Britain. But largely their mutiny exists because they don't believe they're getting their bonuses. They're supposed to get some time off, and they are not getting this time off, and so they ultimately will mutiny. In New Jersey, there's another 200 British soldiers that will mutiny. Ultimately, Washington will disarm these individuals, and we will see him take control of those Brits. In the end, the leaders of the New Jersey mutiny will be killed. But as a result of this movement, ultimately the British forces will be pushed under Cornwallis to Yorktown. James. Yep. Now, Yorktown is chosen as a site because of its location, because it could be easily reinforced but also resupplied. Okay, and the idea here is we will keep the British kind of in Portsmouth, and so Thomas Jefferson actually argues that the best way would be to try to surround them and to come out them here at Yorktown and try to move them into this space and contain them here. So he calls for and asks for additional militia to be brought in from the different now states, okay? But unfortunately, also because it's in Virginia, there are a large number of slaves who are in support of the British and will move to that side. But Washington ultimately sees Yorktown as an opportunity to launch a major strike against the British. He is resupplied and resupported by 10,000 Frenchmen, as well as Continental Army, and he's also has the support of the French fleet. Okay, 3,000 Navy men within the French fleet, led by a guy by the name of de Grasse, and that's not really that important for you, but it allows him to be able to take control of 400 miles of the Virginian coastline. And ultimately, by September 5th, Washington is able to cut off all escape routes out of Yorktown. So they begin then to continue to lay siege to him at the Battle of Yorktown. Okay? And as a result, through the end of this, we see a total of 15,000 American and French troops that will surround a mere 8,000 British troops. They trap Cornwallis, and Cornwallis is forced to surrender his entire army, his entire 8,000 men on October 19th of 1781. The Virginian planters begin to reclaim any of the surviving slaves and take them back as property. Lord North, who is the Prime Minister of Great Britain, will step down from his position.
That's a good name.
Yeah. And George III writes a letter of abdication. Now, what's a letter of abdication?
Like a withdrawal.
A withdrawal from?
War.
Nope. From the throne.
What?
What? Yes. Now, he writes it, but it never, like, he doesn't actually give up the throne. Does that make sense? But
Who?
George III.
Why?
King George. Okay?
I'm sure you'll get that one.
So, the king over here, His Royal Highness, writes this letter, okay, saying, I'm going to step down from the throne. And Yorktown, as a result, then becomes so fundamentally the change then that is necessary. And ultimately, it is the result of Yorktown and the result of the surrender of Cornwallis at Yorktown that will ultimately lead to the end of the war. Okay? Virginia then becomes the last major battleground of the Revolution, and the British will withdraw subsequently out of Charleston and out of Savannah and wind up in New York as their final place where they will hold. And ultimately, the British government in the colonies will collapse by March of 1782. Okay. As a result, oh, yeah, go ahead.
Why did King George write that letter again? Like,
why did he write the letter of
He was so
abdication?
distraught.
Because, yeah, he was distraught. And here's the thing. He's been defeated by the Continental Army. The army that had so low numbers, right, that the idea that they could even remotely have a chance of winning against the crown was something that it's not even something that is a concept that could occur. Does that make sense? Here's the other thing. If you're putting yourself in the position of King George III, you have now lost your largest colony. Now, King George, and to a certain extent, potentially your most profitable colony, right? King George, how does he become king?
oh, okay.
Because they put him there. Does that make sense?
You rather take it out rather than get kicked out?
Yeah, are they going to kick him out now too, that he has failed so miserably? And what happens to the rest of Britain's colonies? Do they too see America break away and decide to formulate their own revolutions?
Later on.
Okay, later, much later, right? But I mean, and some of them not until much more modern day, like India, and then like Jamaica is in 1950, I think, is when Jamaica gets its independence from Britain.
India controlled by France and Britain?
I don't remember. My European history knowledge is not great, so I apologize, but that would be a question I would have to ask Johansson. I don't think so. I think it was just a British colony, but
I know by Dani was British.
yes, yeah.
I don't think the French were ever.
Yeah, I don't think so. But I don't want to say no, they were never there because I don't know 100%. Okay? So somebody who has a computer, look it up quick and tell us. Okay?
On what are we?
But ultimately, was India ever controlled by France at all? Okay. Ultimately, the British lose. Okay. Well, why did the British lose? Okay.
What was the date for the British government?
October 19th, 1781. Under the treaty, the British lose. Why? Because although they can control the cities, they never control the countryside. And quite frankly, it is in the countryside that the United States has the greatest amount of strength and the greatest amount of resilience. You have to recognize that the people in the countryside, more frequently than even the people in the cities, and this reigns true to today, these are individuals that are hardy people. They are individuals who have to live without resources, who have to figure out how to survive in a world that quite frankly is untamed, we wouldn't really think of like backcountry Georgia today as being like untamed, but it is untamed at the time. Does that make sense? There is no support. So these people have figured out how to survive in, quite frankly, what amounted to be a wilderness, right? They've learned how to hunt in this wilderness. They've learned how to utilize the land for their benefit. And because of those frontiersmen being able to figure that out, it makes them a much more formidable force to fight against. And you can control the cities all you want, but if you have these people in the backcountry that are constantly attacking your backside, you will never be able to secure a victory. It is the exact same reason why the United States ultimately will lose Vietnam. Because we can never control those people that are in the hidden parts of Vietnam. We can never control the VC. Does that make sense, guys? And so you have to control all aspects of it. You can't just control one aspect. And the British don't do a good job at that, okay? The British have really poor communication. Start of the war, because of the committees of correspondence, they've already worked out ways to communicate rapidly between groups, and the British don't have that. Okay, the British, on the other hand, also have really no will to fight. Right? They're fighting for the king. So what does that mean? What are we going to gain from fighting? Nothing. We have to fight because he told us so, right? But for the Americans, you are fighting for your home. You are fighting for your land. You are fighting for your prosperity, right? For your opportunity, your ability to have a better life. And anytime any group of people is fighting for their own space, they will fight harder and longer for that. And we knew from the get-go all we had to do was wear down the British so they didn't want to fight anymore. And ultimately that's what we are effective with. The other part of it, yes, the alliance with France helps us. We also, at the very end of the war, we signed an alliance with Spain and an alliance with the Netherlands. Really doesn't give us that great of a advantage strategically. But we do have those alliances, and Britain largely is on their own in their war against us. Okay. Now, ultimately, at the end of the war, we will see the signing of the Treaty of Paris. Okay, marks the official end of the war. In March of 1782, King George will appoint new ministers that will ultimately give America their independence. The talks last for 6 months before eventually the primary treaty isn't actually ratified until April of 1783. The original talks are actually done in secret, and France and Spain continued to fight against Great Britain after the fighting had stopped between the Americans and the British. The French continued to fight against them in the Caribbean, and Spain fights against Great Britain along the Straits of Gibraltar, so that who would have control of that. Ultimately, the treaty itself, Congress states that it would earnestly recommend to the states that property taken from the Loyalists be returned from them. Most of this property is never actually returned. Okay? The British, on the other hand, had to abandon all of their forts in the frontier. This is along the Ohio River Valley, okay? And they had to abandon their forts. Unfortunately, this actually does not occur, and in fact, it's part of the reason why we wind up in war at the War of 1812, sometimes known as the Second War for American Independence. Because really, the British don't really recognize us as a country until really after the War of 1812.
Wait, did we beat them again after that?
Yes.
Over here.
That's why we're here.
I know. Oh, I was just I just heard story, cause they attacked the Capitol and destroyed everything.
Yeah. Burn Washington.
Canadians not appreciate that word.
Yeah, no, they don't. And
And then we just got pissed and then just
yeah. And in fact, with that story of them burning down Washington and burning the Capitol building, Dolly Madison, actually saves like early portraits of George Washington and John Adams. She has them removed from the White House in the weeks leading up to when the White House is actually attacked, believing that there may be an attack on the White House. And it's because of Dolly Madison that we have some of our original portraits of our presidents.
Wow,
So,
that's cool.
Yeah.
Why do they teach this over in England? I had friends on Snapchat who live in Manchester, and I ask them, you guys talk about us?
how they talk about like the
Yeah.
American Revolution.
Yeah, it's a big deal for them. Like,
Yeah.
you guys burnt down our
Yeah, like,
capital.
well, do they like recognize that like their country was in the wrong?
Like,
Well,
Were they?
They're not Holocaust
Well, I mean,
survivors.
to be fair, they were just trying to earn taxes to fund the.
Yeah.
From their perspective, they're just trying to supply the government supply.
Exactly. I mean, like in our perspective, yeah, we won, so we are the ones who get to write the history and say that the British were wrong. But if the British would have won, the colonists, every single one of those Sons of Liberty, would have been tried as traitors,
And we all have blacks.
and Washington himself probably would have been executed. So, I mean, you have to look at it in context of it's written and also where we're at. And do we write that history differently because we're in the United States versus how that history is written or taught, for that matter, in Great Britain? And I'm not a teacher in Great Britain, and I don't, so I have no idea. But I would assume that there are some differences in how the story is taught. Does that make sense? Okay? I would assume. I don't know anybody over there.
Okay, but they teach like the Boston Massacre
Mm-hmm.
from the like viewpoint of the soldiers.
I don't know. It also, I think, depends on what the context of the class is. If the context of the class is, this is British history, right? Like we take American history courses. If they're teaching it from the context of British history, then I think it's going to be from the perspective of British. Does that make sense? And they may not even talk about the Boston Massacre because for them, it's a blip on the radar. Does that make sense?
It really is.
If they're teaching American history in the way that we teach like European history or Western civilization, then maybe they are talking about it more in a sense of how it affects America. Does that make sense? So I think it really just depends on the context of the course.
I'm gonna ask them.
So, but I mean, I do know that there are other countries in the world that do have American history courses as part of their curriculum. And part of that is because of the impact that the United States continually has on decisions that affect the rest of the globe. Does that make sense? So,
First and longest successful democracy.
yeah, whether it's the democracy or it's the spurring of revolutions because of our own revolution, or it is the world wars, or what's that? Our strength of our military, or the economic sanctions that we place upon people, or
Because we can.
Hegemonic control of the world.
or our control over the world, or the fact that our president is in a pissing contest with with Rocket Man.
Oh my goodness.
Rocket Man.
I don't know.
They're losers. The terrorists are losers. ISIS, you're losers.
I literally, we're gonna all die because of the pissing contest. Okay. In the end of it, though, the treaty also says that the British merchants could collect upon the debts, okay, that are owed to them. So it is supposed to be kind of a little bit of two-sided, both parties are supposed to walk away relatively evenly. But under this, then, we will have to forge a new nation. Our nation now becomes everything that is east of the Mississippi River. So we have gone from being here to now, except for we don't get New Orleans, so we're just gonna cut it through here, okay?
All the good food.
Roughly, that is the United States at this point, okay? We don't have the rest of Maine though, and this territory in Ohio and parts of Michigan are still disputed territory, okay? But this now becomes the United States.
Is that all Florida down there?
Yeah, Although
We don't
That's
really-
Spanish until.
it becomes it goes to Spain. So we actually don't have, it's like that, basically, okay?
We're touring in the street.
But that is what becomes the United States. And so now here we have formulated this new nation. We have won our war of independence,
We're one nation.
sort of. Okay? But in forging this new nation, now what do we do next? Okay? Here's the results
Oh
of
my
this
God.
war. Okay?
Nothing.
Continental officers were promised a pension. Soldiers were too, right? They were promised payment in land or in wealth after the war, okay? But we owe France and Spain 11 million, okay? Each state has approximately a total, if you add each of the states' individual debt, okay,
This is
at
not-
21.5. Yes, this is at the
So
time.
this is not accounting?
This is not
this is
accounting for
moderate.
inflation.
Oh, okay.
Okay?
When one aircraft cost $1 billion.
Yeah. Federal domestic debt is sitting at like 42 million. So you add this all up and we are in debt at $75 million. We have just become a country and we are already in debt.
Not bad then. That's not that bad.
But part of the thing that we looked at and part of the problem is some states have more debt than others. Virginia carries more debt than Georgia does. Virginia carries more debt than New York.
Would like
Okay.
a federal tax so we can all chip in?
So here we have some states that are in a worse position than others. Here's the other thing. We really don't have an American identity. We kind of have an American identity. We've united over this idea of war. We've created this union of states in order to fight the war. But the war is now over, and the enemy that we had is now gone. Kind of. So if that enemy is gone, what is there to unite us under a common ideal? Will the states just separate apart and you will have the country of Georgia and the country of Virginia and Massachusetts, and instead of having the United States of America, you have a bunch of countries
Well, if we were
similar
Europe, that's what we'd
to...
do.
Isn't that why it's called the United States? The states, this is not a free country.
Well, yeah, it was. That is, because they were individualized still at that point, yeah.
If we were Europe, that's what we would do.
And if we were Europe, that is exactly what we would do. If we were, if you think about, quite frankly, the vast majority of the world, that is what we would do, is we would become smaller
Because
countries,
they're too stuck.
okay? And in
And then
part
live.
because there is a fear that how do you contain a democracy and how do you run a democracy over this huge expanse of land?
I don't know, but we did it.
Okay? But at the time, there's a great fear that you cannot do that. And if you look
Because it
at
hasn't
all of representative governments, when they've gotten too large, they have collapsed. And, yeah, like Rome.
The Soviet Union.
Okay? Well,
You mean
Well,
representative?
yeah, I don't know if that's really representative.
Okay,
It
then.
was sort of getting there.
For the right party.
Yeah.
No.
But the reality of it is what will happen to us? Will the Union dissolve? And despite the treaty that says the British have to remove all of these forts, ha ha ha,
They never left.
they don't leave,
What do? They just sit in their forts and play cards?
okay?
Literally, like, chop trees?
Yeah,
and
what do they have to do? What
Drink
do
tea?
they do?
Um,
They just live there?
yeah, okay?
Arts and crafts? Eat salted pork?
And the thing is the United States, in creating our new government, when we create the Articles of Confederation, how do we remove the British from those forts?
Just go start taking down the wood fence.
We attack them, we use our military, but we don't have a military. We have a bunch of continentals that were part of militias of states. And how do you pay that debt, or how do you have a military unless you tax? Now wait a second, right?
Yeah, we don't do taxes here.
Taxes.
We're Americans.
Mm,
Boy.
right? And above and beyond it is sort of why we went to war, above and beyond the disputed territory that is here, this area, although technically it belongs to the United States, it is also being disputed between us and Spain. Because as a result of Spain's war against Great Britain over the Straits of Gibraltar, Spain will get back Florida. Does that make sense? Okay? And Spain maintained this after the French and Indian War, so this becomes disputed territory. Does it actually belong to America, or does it belong to Spain? As far as we're concerned, it's ours. As far as the Spanish are concerned, it's theirs. And so the Spanish will subsequently build forts in that area, in that disputed territory. But again, we don't have an army, so what are you going to do about it, America?
Wait, no, all this work's called Confederation.
Yes, Fort Confederation. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay.
Say Confederation.
It's not French, it's Spanish.
Well, you said it German.
Now-
Confederation.
We need to go back a little bit, because 1776, we write our Declaration of Independence. But with writing our Declaration of Independence, we have to consider, what the heck are we going to have for a government? How are we going to make this work?
King Washington.
Okay? Yeah. And that legitimately becomes one of the first questions when we actually form our democracy, because we're not there yet. Okay? We're not there to the Constitution yet. But it will become a question of what do we call the leader of our government? Okay?
I'm all for the kids.
Right? But the bigger questions become is, how do you deal with these state governments? John Adams basically argues that in his thoughts on government, he says, look, in order for our government to truly function, here's what we should set it up. We should have 3 branches of a government, so they can balance each other out, right? You have an executive, a legislative, and a judicial. He says we should have a bicameral legislature. In other words, we should have a 2-house legislature, which makes sense if we're coming from the English model. Parliament has 2 houses, right? So it kind of makes sense where he's going here. There needs to be this balance of power, and there needs to be popular sovereignty. In other words, the people need to have the right to vote, and everything should be based on the will of the people, whatever the people want. Now, there's a problem with true popular sovereignty.
Not everyone's educated.
A, not everybody's educated. In fact, very few people are educated, okay? So that's going to be a difficult. You have women, you have slaves, right? So who is going to be a part of this popular sovereignty? Is it white male landowners? Is it all white men? Do we include women within this ideal, okay? And as he's sitting at the Second Continental Congress, John Adams gets a letter from his wife. Now, John and Abigail have been writing letters back and forth to each other constantly. They always write letters back and forth to each other, okay? I mean, it's what they do, right? And if you think about it, here he is sitting at the Continental Congress, and he is gone for months at a time, okay? So how else do you keep in touch with the person that you are married to but write letters? No Twitter, no like FaceTime or whatever else, right? So they write these letters back and forth between them over this question of liberty, right? And she says to her husband in one of these letters, okay? She says,
Just turn the air conditioning on.
this is March 31st of 1776. She says that she longs to hear that we have declared independency, that we have declared our independence, right? Okay? And she says, and part of her letter, and I just gave you an excerpt in your reading, but part of her letter, she talks about what's going on at home and what's going on, like, because they do run a plantation. So she's talking about the business of the household, and she talks about some pets, and she talks about the children, right? And so the conversation is really pretty like normal per se, until she writes, she says, and by the way, and this is towards the end of her letter, FYI. So here she's talking about all this normal, like, pleasantries, whatever, right? And at the end she says, by the way, okay, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I would desire that you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. She says, remember, oh, that comes a little bit later, sorry. She says, do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion. Woe is right, okay? Here's this mundane conversation has now gone from her having this mundane, normal wife voice to saying,
Put divorce on the table.
okay, if you do not care for us, we recognize that you as husbands are acting in the same manner as the crown. Remember, in the Declaration of Independence, and in all of these other documents and the rights of grievances, everything, we have called out the king as being a tyrant. We have argued, and we are currently in the process of fomenting this rebellion, right? Because this is March of 1776, so we're not actually at war, full-blown yet, right? Okay? And so she's talking about women utilizing the exact same language that the Sons of Liberty are using, and quite frankly, that her husband is using, right? She goes on in her letter to her husband and says that we will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. She's a smart woman. She is educated. Unlike many women of her time, she is well educated. She comes from a very wealthy background, so she has an education, okay? She says that your sex is naturally tyrannical, is so thoroughly established as to admit of no dispute. But as such as you wish to be happy and willing to give up the harsh title of master for the more tender, endearing one of friend, why then not put it out of the power of the vicious and the lawless to use us with cruelty and indignity with impunity? She says, men of all sense in all ages, whose customs which treat us only as the vassals of your sex, regard us then as beings by providence under your protection and the imitation of supreme beings to make use of your power for only our happiness, right? Now, there are people that look at her letter and argue that Abigail Adams is asking for women to have the right to vote, to be a part of that popular sovereignty. Now, as a historian, I would argue she is not. Okay, I've done lots of research on Abigail. She's one of my ladies. I like her, okay? She is not. But she is arguing that there needs to be a better system that better cares for the rights of women. And that they cannot just be looked upon as being this bearer of children, this object for men to utilize in whatever way they so wish. That women should have an education. And we know this because in later letters between her and her husband, she very specifically talks about that women needed to have an education. Because in this republic, it would be the women, not the husbands, that would be ensuring the future of the republic through raising of children. And how can you raise real Republicans if you do not have an education yourself? How can you teach them about democracy and about these grand principles of the Enlightenment if you yourself have no understanding of them? Does that make sense? So that is really what she's calling for. But it is a question that is pervasive of who do we give these things to. Now, her husband responds back to her, "We will not be held despotism of the petticoat." In other words, know your place, woman.
Go back to the kitchen.
Go back to the kitchen.
Make a pie.
Go make a pie. Go cook me something, right? Okay.
Like she's coming out of the night
Yeah.
and he's like, all right, here's the tomatoes and the bread and the mayo.
Yeah.
Make me a sandwich.
Go make me a sandwich, right? Like, I mean, that's kind of his response to her, okay? He also says that I hope General Washington and all of our brave heroes would fight, and I'm sure that every good politician would plot against that despotism. But like, he really is like, basically reacts to her in the way that you would expect a man of his time to react to his wife,
I think Georgia,
saying these same things.
I think
What's
Georgia's
that?
been different. I think Georgia's been like,
Okay, Abigail, I'll try.
Yes and no. George, with his relationship with Martha, is quite endearing. In fact, I actually really like John and Abigail's relationship also. I think their relationship and their ability to have these conversations and meaningful conversations with each other shows really how much respect he actually has for Abigail, because otherwise he would just not even respond to her whatsoever at all. Does that make sense?
the kids are good.
The fact that he responds shows you that he actually does have quite a bit of respect for her. But at the same time, he also recognizes that, no, we are not going to give women any voice or power within this system. Okay? We'll pick up talking about the other types of constitutions on Monday. Read the entirety of the letter. It's great. It's super saucy. Plus, it's your homework tonight.
I'd say Abigail didn't really do so good. Because like women didn't get to vote till 1900.
True.
She kind of failed.
Oh my goodness.
Oh yeah.
No, he felt that.